Thanks for having me, Ben. Really appreciate being here and having a chance to show some artwork and talk about this film. So I'd also like to introduce Kyle McQueen. Kyle, are you out there? Can you say hi?
Hey everyone.
Okay. Kyle's a production designer. So we're going to kind of two-hand this, and I'm going to share my screen right now. Do let me know if there's any technical issues. All right, you seeing my full screen here? Yeah, okay, cool. So so today me and Kyle, we're gonna share with you some art, behind the scenes footage from the film, and talk about our process. And the reason that, I was excited to do this with Kyle was to talk about the relationship of design to story and how the two, kind of right brain, left brain approaches to filmmaking, evolve over the course of 4 years, and how it's a learning process kind of between our two sides of the world. So ultimately, the story started with a book called The Willoughbys by Lois Lowry, who's a Newbery Award-winning author. And when I read the book, it appealed to me because it sort of had that Roald Dahl subversive kind of comedy undertone. And it was essentially, if you haven't seen the movie, it's a story about 4 kids who find an orphan and decide that their lives would actually be better if they were orphans too. The only problem is they have parents, pretty rotten parents. So really, it's a story about this family, and ultimately, it's meant to be a funny tale of neglect and dysfunction, which is somewhat unusual for animation. So my pitch back to the studio when I was initially breaking the story was really, could we do Grey Gardens meets Arrested Development for kids? Because you know how kids love those independent documentaries. So ultimately, the book sort of starts with this concept of an old-fashioned family. So very early on, before really we were even a film, we were just kind of poking around. I hired a friend of mine named Pete Oswald to come in, and he did a pass on the characters. And then I also hired another friend named Heidi Smith, who worked on Paranorman, and she did a pass on the characters, and Walter Tulip. So I had these artists from all over the world kind of contributing. And Robin Joseph was another friend of mine from Toronto, and we were getting a lot of these ideas. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is have this conversation about this old-fashioned family colliding with a modern world. So one of the things that we really wanted to hang on to is the fact that this is not a documentary. I mean, we're telling a story of neglect and these kids that are trying to, for lack of a better word, kind of, off their parents. We needed to kind of find a way to keep this funny and to keep it in the space of it being a friendly approach to these big ideas. So early on, we developed this idea, like, what if it became a cat's tale? There was a cat in the book. And so that notion sort of took us to the kind of parable, this sort of off-kilter comedy point of view. And at this point, this is where, enter the production designer, the brilliant Kyle McQueen. So Kyle, do you want to talk about sort of where we launched off to the next phase of development?
Sure. So usually what I do when I first come in is hang everything off of stories. So when I read the book, it was one of the weirdest children's books that I'd ever read. And so what I wanted to do was take the sensibility of the tone that I got from it and kind of push that into the design. And while we had a lot of beautiful stuff from Pete and Robin and everybody else, for me personally, I didn't feel like we had hit the tone of the story yet. We weren't quite doing justice to Lois Lowry's writing, and a lot of the conversations Kris and I were having was that Roald Dahl aspect of it, and the weirdness and subversive opinion of it. So what I like to do when I first come in is just kind of build this visual language guide. And really the function of that is it's a look of picture Bible for all departments. It's something we can continue to reference back to. And ultimately it's a really simple, quick, and loose way to iterate and start to build up the visual language of the tone, hanging things off of the tone of the story. So the first step is I kind of break it down into synonyms. So trying to find descriptive words that illustrate the tone verbally, and then start to play with finding visuals that support that. So
that's this one, right?
Yeah. So we start to build a mood board essentially. And from this, what you're starting to develop is color and texture, and you're starting to develop a language of shape and design. And then if we switch to the next, the opposite of that with the using antonyms to sort of describe visually what we're not aiming for. So right away, you can see the difference between these two slides. And this is a really effective tool for pitching to executives as well, because they love to sort of see, it's a very clean, clear way for them to understand where we want to go and what we're trying to avoid. And they can really get on board. Probably easier than, a bunch of concept art. So this is even before we've put pen to paper or whatever.
No Kanye West, no tornadoes, no naked Shreks, right? We're steering from that.
Exactly. So it's not a sterile cold film. It didn't have that tone to me. It was this weird subversive. The absurdity is what I really loved about it, and the kind of off kilter humor. So from there, the main job of the production designer is to kind of, you're not just focused on design of characters, and you're not just focused on environments or color. It's every aspect of filmmaking on the visual side. And really, it has to work in tandem with the story. So you need a really close relationship to your director and your story department. So I was lucky enough to be able to sit in on a lot of those early story discussions and, weigh in when necessary, but also hear what story was starting to discuss and then take that back to the design team. And we could start to explore those ideas visually once we sort of had this framework. So, thinking about our camera language, our shot design and composition and lighting, all of these things are what we have to consider in these early days and find the harmony in the design language across the entirety of the film.
Should I talk to the next one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So starting with character design, I mean, it's a great place to start, especially when you're trying to figure out, these are the actors of your film. So ultimately they're the ones who are giving the most to the audience. And so starting with character design is just a great way to kind of explore a lot of things in terms of texture and color, performance, etc. So we were looking at a lot of Chuck Jones and Ronald Searle, these kind of pushed, absurd, kind of funny designs, and trying to figure out what's our version of that.
I guess it's the permission to be funny was really key in our conversations early on, right, Kyle? In terms of
and it's these really strong caricatures, these really iconic designs, really strong silhouettes, and a simple clarity. And the other side of that being you have to consider performance as well. So creating a design that's hard to animate or may not offer a good performance kind of defeats the purpose. So you have to think about all these things in tandem.
And so with all that kind of going on, this idea of a cat, and we had these early designs from Rob and Joseph, ultimately we wanted to push it over onto the style, right? And so enter, was this you, Kyle, or was this Craig Hellman? I can't remember who did this design.
This is when we brought Craig in. So the cat was a really great anchor for, the tone of the film. Ricky Gervais being, very sarcastic and a strong, obviously, incredibly comedic, but we didn't just want a caricature for the cat. We wanted something that could be that was fluid and iconic. And
very early on, these tests are just simple geometry, but Corey Evans, who was the co-director, he was feeling like we need to ground this cat even more. So we went back in with Craig, and he just how many designs? He must have done like 400 different cat designs, playing around with trying to, And as you said, Kyle, I mean, Ricky Gervais, being the voice of the character, is always very important for me to make sure that the voice feels right coming out of the design. So not that we're trying to parody Ricky or caricature him per se. We wanted to make sure that it didn't feel like it was the wrong tone or the wrong volume. And Ricky as an actor kind of does what Ricky does, and really we wanted the cat to be kind of a comedian who just pokes fun at the stupidity of humans. So it kind of made sense to just hire the animal lover that is Mr. Gervais to do that. And do you want to talk about sort of how we got to that final design?
Yep. So a lot of those early designs that we saw on the previous slide were really pushed, really characterized. And I think what we weren't getting is this personality through. It sort of felt like a character that could be funny in scene, but if this character needed to talk or portray emotion, would we be able to get that out of that design? So we pulled it back and just grounded him a little bit more, but kept, the simple anatomy, the clean lines, and really focused on the expressive features, and this sort of soft, fluid creature that we ended up with. This started to really inform the textures as well. We wanted, when you have such a sleek look and a pushed graphic design, hanging real fur off of that would have seemed odd. So we found a way to use velvet to get the same idea across as fur, but it also enhanced the elegance and the handmade appeal that we started to discover during this process.
Like a walking, talking pillow, right?
Yeah.
And like, I think the notion of it being like a cat's tail too. I mean, the heightened textures kind of made you feel like you were always in a parable as opposed to being in a documentary, which really helped. And of course, the cat as the character who's subversive was there to disarm the audience so they could enjoy the comedy of our characters, which is really, it's a story about a boy named Tim, a short-panted boy named Tim. And early on, like, one of the things that we were really thinking of from the book was, how do you take this sort of aggressive personality and make it likable? And we were looking at examples of kind of comedic leads, and whether it's Dwight Schrute from The Office or Moe from The Three Stooges. I mean, I don't know if I'd want to hang out with these guys on the weekend, but I always enjoyed watching them. So there was something in the tone of like a caustic character in that kind of John Cleese Fawlty Towers way that felt right for Tim. So very early on, Pete Oswald was playing with that old-fashioned notion, and I think we were kind of feeling like there's something here that's working, but it was dating the movie in the wrong way, and so it wasn't like the subversion wasn't coming through. The two in the middle actually look like Canadian prime ministers, and Pete's from Salt Lake City, so I don't know how he landed there. If you're Canadian, you'll know who they were. This notion really kind of popped out though. When Pete did this design, it was like the idea of adolescence. So one of the ideas that felt really funny that latched the character was this notion, like maybe 2 months before the movie started, Tim shot up like 12 inches and his legs kind of grew out of the bottom of his one pair of trousers. So he's had like one pair of trousers his whole life. So it's like the way a tree will grow around a post, that kind of notion. And then Kyle, you and Kelman kind of picked that up. Do you want to talk about sort of where?
Yeah, and really, I think the more we talked about Tim's character and the more he developed, the more the design developed to accompany that. So really, as his personality was pushed, so did his design. And how far could we take this character, and what kind of a performance could we get out of it? And these designs here were really where a lot of those design choices started to lock and land, with the bowl cut and the stretch neck and all of that. And that's where we started to feed it into the characters moving forward. So early on, locking down Tim was really important and really, really helpful to kind of pushing the rest of the characters through.
I know in this early test, the thing that I really responded to was just like the simple shapes that were created in the legs. It definitely reminded me of that kind of John Cleese kind of physical comedy where it's like really big choices being made. And ultimately, Tim as a character, we wanted to make sure that while he was, for lack of a better word, a little anemic, all the Willoughbys were a little starved. And the idea is that they're kind of mummified in their old fashioned life. And so the movie was really about the need for like breaking down the walls that kind of keep us from growing. And so we were kind of visually trying to illustrate that without screaming it at the audience, but we also needed to illustrate his want. And so the flip side of the want is I wanted the audience to root for Tim, because really what he wants is something that's good. He wants to be in a great family. He wants to be connected to something. And I think all kids and all adults sort of, have that sort of foothold to that idea. And so this notion of a legacy that kind of runs through the Willoughby yarn that, gives Tim something to want, but also puts pressure on him to kind of, achieve was a really interesting idea. And like Kyle, these designs, we kind of had backstories for a lot of these Willoughby characters, and they were all kind of like in hindsight, they're kind of shitty people, but in Tim's eyes, they were like superheroes, right? That was kind of the notion.
Yeah, the intention was to just create this kind of tapestry, this framework of these whether they were great or not, these legacies and these great people that in Tim's eyes they were. So we needed, we wanted a broad range of, I mean, it wasn't subtle that, they're all men, and, Tim just he's getting the wrong ideas from this wall, which sort of fed into as the story moved forward, and what Tim's want and what the audience wanted to see his change be.
Right. Kind of the breaking down the patriarchy and sort of moving into a more evolved state of what it means to be in a family. And so one of the things I wanted to play, I always like showing really early cut sequences. So I wanted to play the storyboarded opening for the film that we had for quite a while. And we ended up cutting it. But what I think it was really successful at was showing Tim's want and sort of giving you a sense of sort of how we could have fun with this idea of these characters living under the legacy of a past that was not necessarily their future. So I'll let it play. And some of these boards, I think a lot of it was Florent Lagrange was the board artist. So I will let her roll.
Once upon a time, there was a family named Willoughby. A noble family, a prolific family, an old-fashioned family. Through time and history, conquest and empire, generation after generation, the Willoughbys have endured. Yeah! Willoughbys! More ammo! What?
Happy things are here to stay,
Jane!
like sunny days and fields of hay, where all the cats will come to play. What?
Are you cracked? How am I supposed to win this despicable war if you don't follow orders? You're on a battleground here.
Why can't we just sing?
Willoughbys don't sing. Jane? Huh? What are you doing up there? We're flying, Tim. Willoughbys don't fly. We've learned. How? Bees. Where did you get these? Right here, Tim. Incoming! Barnaby's! Ow! 200 points off for unleashing wild.
I'll stop it there. But like the idea of like Tim being bossy and the other kids sort of getting in his way of his fantasy was one of these big ideas that, we kept in the film. But one of the things we started to learn as we were, adding voice to these characters and sort of building them out was how, from the book, there was this notion that Tim was really bossy but had a heart of gold. And we were trying to illustrate that. Jane was a bit more of a mousy character in the story. And we wanted to make sure that we were honoring Lois's idea of her, but she was coming off as almost like too passive and Tim was getting too aggressive. So what we needed to do was kind of change Jane's approach and lift her into kind of creating a bit more of an adversarial two-hander with Tim. These are early designs from Luis Granier, which I love, but again, they were kind of too close to the book. And these designs by Pete Oswald, there was a sentimentality we liked, and there was that sort of sense of her, feeling like a very kind of emotionally connected character. But it wasn't until Kyle did these drawings where I feel like Jane started to show herself. Kyle, did you want to talk about these ones? They're sort of like a danger to her here. Like she looks like she could give Tim a little bit more of a run for his money.
Yeah, I think it was about finding a little bit of mystery in Jane, and her her curiosity is dangerous to Tim, and I think it's a threat, and it goes against everything that he stands for. So we wanted to try and get that in where we could. And when Craig, we threw it back to Craig and he came up with these final designs, we really felt like we'd hit that balance of, this wide-eyed, optimistic little girl who could really push against Tim, and we could get some really fun relationships there.
I kind of forgot, actually, I haven't watched that sequence in a long time, how the idea that Jane was a character who had like a voice that nobody listened to was an early idea. And this idea of her being a musical character was something that was forming fairly early, because one of our pivots was like, instead of picking on the tropes of children's literature, we wanted to pick on the tropes of children's film. And the idea that Jane kept trying to turn the movie into a Disney musical, but then Tim stopped it, felt funny to me. And I don't know whether that sort of came through to the audience, but it was there right to the end. And it's not until the very end of the film that Tim says, okay, let's just do a musical while they're dying on the side of an elf. But it's a good time to, I guess, change. And then, of course, we had the twins. And the problem with the, any of these films is sort of trying to figure out how do you balance an ensemble. So in the book, the twins were actually older than Jane, and they were a bit more like kind of clones of Tim. So we actually started our design journey kind of looking at that idea that, maybe they're like little Tim wannabes, and that sort of through line kind of took us to this notion of, what if they were smarter than Tim, but they had less voice? And then that idea that they kind of were feral kids raised on books, all of that started to develop into these notions of them being a little bit, kind of windblown, or a little bit sort of Einsteinish, and so that idea sort of formed pretty early. But as you can see in these early tests with the twins, like, we were still trying to figure out what their tone was. I mean, we were playing with cartooning, kind of zips. We were playing with them sort of being very snappy. But actually it was what we were running into was like a lot of noise. And I remember, Kyle, when you did these drawings, there was something about the twins in the lower left, based on Danny from The Shining, because we all know twins are a little creepy, that really sort of clicked, right? Because then suddenly we came up with this idea: what if they weren't that animated? Like, what if they became more like graphic totem poles, right?
Yeah, they were pillars for the comedy, more or less. And I think, their brains are their superpower. So let's push that to the forefront and try and create this really iconic design, focus on performance opportunity rather than dialogue, because, we were going to strip that back. And finding the age balance was a tricky thing here. Some skew, you could see in the designs, there's a bit of a range, and especially from where we started to where we landed. And I think, again, with Kelman coming in and sort of taking it on, we landed on something that right away felt right and iconic, and really pushed clean silhouettes and something we could have a lot of fun with.
And like how each of the character has like some sort of emblem of the neglect that they're wanting. So Tim's short pants kind of represent that. I think Jane, the fact that she's never had a haircut, kind of gives you the sense that, she probably has never had that combed either. And I love the idea that this sweater was maybe inherited by Tim, and it was probably harvested from Dad's mustache. And so it's like the Willoughby color, but it's slightly like a different tone in the way that, a really old woolen sweater will kind of start to pick up all the soot in the air and everything, right? So I also think like the lack of movement, there was a big bit of development that kind of came from this sweater, right? In terms of what these twins were, because that was their signature, right, Kyle?
Yeah, and it didn't feel right to, once we had these really pushed designs, to hang, real world textures and scale on them. So instead, we decided to push the scale of texture as well, and found, that was working. It made them funnier. It made everything funnier. And then once we
made that woman funnier,
made that woman and
that's
warm.
A big choice, right?
Very warm. And the sweater became this, it became this sort of through gag, and it's like their iconic sort of tick that they had throughout the film. And this was really exciting because the twins became sort of the template for everything else moving forward in terms of texture and scale.
And their lack of movement, it was really driven by this test by Kane Peckerell, who's the animator. But like, we could have done a more complicated move, but the fact that it was so simple, now we could pepper it all through the film and have sweater swaps like at accent points that maybe the audience picks up on, maybe they don't. But to pick up off the sweater, I mean, certainly the Willoughby hair is a big signature. Kyle, do you want to take this one?
Yep. And so, once we kind of hit on the sweater, we thought, well, where else can we apply this idea? And so again, thinking about the cat and how the idea of real fur didn't really sit right, and the idea of a real world scale didn't really sit right. So this idea of yarn and looking at stop motion and how they apply these handmade textures, it creates this sort of really wondrous fantasy kind of feeling to these characters. And that's really what, once we hit that, then we were off and running, and that felt really good. Everything started to really come together, and that idea just spread throughout the rest of the film and led us down
like a string of yarn, right, Kyle? You're doing
string of yarn.
Well, there's also the metaphor that we're all kind of connected through the red yarn of fate, which sort of seemed like a nice sort of lineage for the family that we could sort of say without saying it. And also, who plays with yarn but cats? So this is still a cat's tale, right? One of the things that really started to inform us too is like how we were going to treat overlap, and like the way that our motion style was going to adapt was going to be almost Kyle was talking about stop motion, but it's also 2D animation. Like I'm an old hand-drawn animator. So the notion of us like kind of controlling overlap and controlling big shapes with lots of detail internally, that choice of the yarn hair really kind of moved through everything that we chose kind of from that point forward. And you can kind of see with the lack of movement how the texture actually steps forward, I think. Don't you think, Kyle?
Yeah, it keeps them interesting even if they're standing still.
Of course, there's a family one is born into. One of our big themes is like the journey that we all go through in life, from the family you're born into to the family you eventually choose. And their kids are that's their coming of age story. And so the family they choose by the end of the film all represent the outside world. And so one of the things that we wanted to really adhere to was the discipline that the Willoughbys were all connected by this kind of the color, the texture, and that kind of shape language of being a little bit starved. And then all the creatures and animals and humans that came into their world came from a different place, right? So that collision, we wanted to tell that story through design. So do you want to talk about this one, Kyle?
So Ruth sort of came out of this idea of Tim resisting the outside world. And as that story point started to develop more, that was really interesting. So she came in and is this bright splash of new color in their sort of subdued autumnal palette within the Willoughby house. Again, sort of alien to the kids and alien to this family, and a little bit of a threat to Tim as it represents something he's trying to avoid or push away from.
And if you watch the movie, the baby sort of moves and has a kinetic energy based on what other characters are projecting into her. So Tim looks at her as a threat, like a monster. So the beginning of her story, she's almost like one of those alien face huggers. And that face hugging is really her telling you what she wants, which is love, which is what all humans probably deep down at some point in their life desire. And so it's not until Nanny towards the middle of Act 2 calls her a baby that her performance actually changes. So we wanted a design that could let her have that range. And that certainly on the comedy front, that idea of like Mr. Magoo, you never really worry about Mr. Magoo, even though he might be in a lot of dangerous situations. We wanted to have that same sort of confidence in Ruth. So while she, technically got thrown into a fireplace, the audience, I didn't want the audience to worry about her. I wanted them to enjoy the collision of those personalities. And that sort of fed into our fish out of water themes, that as they go into the world, we wanted the Willoughbys to always feel like they stood out. And one of the big characters from the book was this idea of Commander Melanoff, who was a tragic sort of figure. So he kind of represented a lot of the tropes of like Willy Wonka or Daddy Warbucks. I think, Lois Lowry always called him a benevolent benefactor. And so, leaning into the idea that he's got a different shape language. Oops, cool. So, so Kyle, one of the things you were kind of excited about is this idea of Melanoff. So like this sort of mysterious East, right? Like this sort of.
Yeah, and he was an opportunity to bring more diversity and representative of the real world, the outside world. And so, Pete had some really great early designs, but again, I want to try and take them further and go along this idea of this sort of sad clown, this man wearing his costume, who ultimately inside is sad, but creates these things, these objects that bring so much joy to the world. So that irony was really fun to play around with in his design.
And when I was writing the script, very, very early on, sort of knew I wanted to work with Terry Crews again. So I'd worked with Terry on the Cloudy franchise, and one of the things when you meet Terry is like, he's an ex-NFLer, and he's got this movie star sort of confidence, and he walks into the room, you feel the air change, and he's very intimidating. And then the second you get to know him, he's this sort of artistic, goofy guy who will kind of almost, give you anything. Like, he's just such a joyful human being. And, over the time of working with him on 2 movies, got to meet his whole family and stuff. And so there's a whole theme that I sort of felt like he represented, which is sort of, tough exterior, sweet interior. And that sort of felt right for the voice. And so very early on in the writing, I was trying to get that into that character. And then, like, Kyle, you picked that up in terms of like how to illustrate that, the idea that there's like a sterility that is like not necessarily presenting joy, but the joy is there if you look for it, right?
Yeah, and it's his exterior is sort of artificial, and it's not, he's sort of hiding himself, and
like an expensive cake.
Exactly. And so that was really fun, pushing color, but really it goes against who this person really is.
And with these great designs, so Sarah Keeley did these amazing illustrations, and we love them for like the cartooning and the broadness. And this led to Eric Burnett, one of our animators, did a 2D test, just using, I think he was using Flash for this. But one of the things that we started to feel, and this is basically a whole thing's a Polaroid, like it's a process. But as we started to work with the voice, as we started to sort of fit him into the world, that idea of repression sort of felt necessary. And so all of those kind of early broad designs, while they informed us, they sort of felt like wrong for the statement of the character. And then when you did this drawing, suddenly the whole world of Melanoff latched in for me. Do you want to talk about what this represented?
Yeah, and it was sort of a reflection of him, this sort of cold, shut off place away that kind of tries to keep attention away from itself and keep the outside world out. And that theme connects directly with the Willoughby house and the Willoughby family, and ultimately Tim. And so trying to find an extension of his personality in this place, yet when you crack that surface and you go inside, there's all this luscious color and beauty inside, and all this joy. So that was really fun to play around with. And the monochromatic feel, again, it's a contrast to the warm autumnal palette of the Willoughby house, and then we could layer that rainbow color on top of that and really get something that felt really fun.
And the idea of like a trapped rainbow is a big theme for our film, right? And we loved like the nod to Wizard of Oz, that somewhere over the rainbow your dreams will come true. And also, with eyes wide open, we knew that the rainbow is a symbol of freedom and pride and change and growth. And so we really wanted to lean into, I think, that metaphor throughout the whole film. One of the things that we had to sacrifice in the story, which is always, I think, fun to show, is Melanoff's backstory. So when we were developing the script, from the book, there was this whole tangent that explained how the commander became, an orphan himself, how he lost his own family. And we were trying to find a fun way to kind of explain his dysfunction. And one of the ideas was like, what if we put a cartoon in the cartoon? And so we were going to tell his story using stop motion. So Kyle's team with Sarah Keeley, you built all of this stuff kind of using real practical assets. And so like taking what we were doing digitally, we were going to try to do physically. So we had a 3-week shoot, and we actually animated his whole love story. And then we cut it. We cut it for time, because it's one of those things where it's like when we drift away from the kids, we felt we were losing connection with the audience. So it's a little Easter egg, and it's on the internet, but I'm going to play the short. And if you watch the movie, this is nested on TV screens all around in different places through the film. But this is how Commander Melanoff became an orphan.
I'm Commander Melanoff, and this is my story. Candy was my life's passion. I turned sugar into joy. And that joy led me to her, my sweetie. We fell into syrupy love. Oh. But she had chosen another. gelato. The jealousy I felt for this outside sweet drove me insane. To win back her love, I had to be the best. But nothing I made was as rich as gelato.
Hey, guy, I purchased some gelato.
No, not ready. Go away, sweetie.
Stop calling me sweetie. My name is Ruth.
Ruth? I didn't know her name was Ruth. Lickety twist. Sweetie, Ruth, sweetie Ruth, you are gonna love me now. She left me. And now, all I do is work. Randy dandy. Randy dandy.
Sometimes hard to believe it's a job that we do this. So it's weird being in Skywalker Ranch trying to mix that and you know, it's basically a cautionary tale of an animator's life. You know, all you do is work until everybody's gone, making other children laugh. So, you know, ultimately, the next kind of big pivotal character that was in the book was the nanny. So this is a Lois Lowry illustration from the story, and in the book, she's really leaning into the tropes of what it. You know, we all know what the nannies are in children's literature, whether it's Mary Poppins or, you know, in movies, Nanny McPhee. And so we were kind of in that world of like, how do we iterate on that? So early on talking to Pete, one of the things I was curious about is like, well, what if we look at this city as being Chicago or Toronto, and who would be the type of person that might be, you know, looking to take a job as a under the table nanny with, you know, a weird old family. You know, it might be a college student, somebody who just, you know, graduated with a lot of student debt, maybe somebody at the beginning of her you know, of her life. And so there was something kind of interesting about that. But what we were feeling was it was a tricky line to walk, because we wanted to bring in this notion of diversity and sort of challenge the Willoughby legacy, but we also didn't want to make this pandering. We didn't want to make this sort of feel too like too off the cuff. So working with Craig Kelman, he you know, cued us to this at the time, this new singer named Lizzo. And I remember seeing her on Saturday Night Live, and there was just something like so joyful and like expressive and full of, you know, just sort of like, you can't help but smile when you see her perform live. And so that became really exciting to us. And I'm going to rip through a bunch of these designs. Cal, do you want to talk about sort of what we were experimenting with here?
Yeah, I mean, it's some of them are pretty self-explanatory. Really early on, it was just caricaturing Lizzo and just trying to find, you know,
this is kind of Barba Papa, isn't it? You know,
really trying to dig it out. And so, you know, the more we explore, I think again, Kelman, you know, he's a machine, and so we had you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of these different designs, just trying to find shape and again that something iconic to ground this character along with all the other characters. And with this heart hair, we hit upon this, you know, again, the hair started to become this thing that every character, it was, you know, what's their version of that? And
yeah, from Melanoff's cotton candy mustache to the Willoughby yarn, that like
exactly.
We literally had a heart-shaped fro, right?
Yeah, and so she represented love. She represented a big hug that the kids needed, and then you were saying, Kris, once you cast Maya, that's when things started to really lock in.
Yeah, and I think, you know, working with Miss Rudolph was kind of, you know, a dream come true. And like one of the things I always look for is pairing. So we'd had Will Forte cast as Tim, and I always love like all the sketches from SNL and, you know, whether it's you know, sitcoms or whatever, but Maya and Will are great together. MacGruber, you know, they have what's the ghost sex on a graveyard, right? So their pairing felt right to me. And so what I wanted to play you was a very early scene boarded by Corey Evans, where we were really playing with Nanny as a broad character. And so she was going to come in and challenge Tim. So what we're trying to do is really kind of build out that sort of collision, that conflict, that comedy pairing here. And then I'm going to talk about sort of what we learned after playing the scene.
Oh, interesting.
Wow! What evil sound darkens our Willoughby hearth? Huh?
must be the children. I'm your nanny.
Nanny?
I've got no qualifications, but a cheery disposition. If you please, dear child.
Huh? No! As head Willoughby, I command thee to leave, woman!
Ah, poor short-panted tot. I know you must miss your parents terribly, but Nanny's here to fill their britches.
So we were playing with that Mary Poppins sort of like where she's got a fake British accent, and she'd just done I think her husband had just done a movie in England, so they were living over there and working with a nanny there. She was kind of using that real person's voice and trying to, character that. But what we found in our screenings was actually that it was starting to be what we like to call wacky stack. So Tim's voice when he's playing his adolescent self was really quite broad and screechy in that sort of slightly annoying way. And then when she was coming in with her push character, we were burying the lead in terms of what she was bringing to the kids. So ultimately, like I think I was sitting and having like just a quiet moment between takes with Maya, and she was talking about her kids, and that was like a big light bulb that went off. It's like, what if you just do what you are, you know what I mean, and sort of represent that sort of, that theme of what is very maternal and very kind of warm, and that idea of love. And so as we sort of pushed that through the character, she started to become the emotional center of the story. And one of the things that really felt right was sort of like pushing that emotional center to this sort of like athleticism of like really strong shape language, right, Kyle? Like you did these.
Yeah,
lines,
even though we kind of moved away from Lizzo as a caricature to base this character on, that idea of, her silhouette and just this, dynamic fluid movement that she could have, and we wanted to keep that and, push where we could, and keep her really interesting.
And there's a very early test here where you kind of get that flour sack animation, right? And as this refined, the other thing that she brings into the world is color, and she opens up the mood ring of what that house is. And I think, this is a good place to maybe throw it over to another super important character in our movie, which is the set.
Yeah. And, if we go back to the visual language guide, at the same time, we're thinking about the character design. We're also thinking about, sets and props and those be characters themselves. And I think that's really important to understand, is that, the environments are characters. Yes, they're backdrop for performance, but they should have a personality themselves. And early on, we wanted this to have an illustrative feel like a kid's book. So a lot of our inspiration came from that. So we were looking at Sasek and Paul Hogarth and Don Silverstein and Eric Soko and artists like that, it was a push design, but it wasn't so pushed in the sense of a Jim Flora or John Hubley or Maurice Noble, where it still had a grounding to it. And it allowed, the characters to be the thing that we could push, and the performance to be a thing we could push, and the personality of the world and the city that they live in to stay a little more grounded, but supportive of all of those choices.
And like not so grounded that it became cold, right? This is one of our very early designs where it almost felt like there was an affluence there, which sort of felt wrong, right?
Yeah, again, it needed to be pushed, but not so far that the audience then became confused and we didn't know where to look at. We had to have something that we could put the performance against and always be able to get a clean read and a clean silhouette with our characters.
And one of the things, so this sort of takes us into, I think, how shape language feeds into that, right?
Yeah, just breaking down, those influences into what makes the look and the things to look out for and things we want to hit on the modeling side as well as the design side, and trying to just find a way to get more handmade feel into it, loosen things up, loosen up the line work of a 3D image, and sort of push away wherever we could in that. So this idea of skewing all our arcs and taking things off the center line, and that lean became something that we used throughout the design of our props and environments, to instill a sense of dynamism into the set.
You were a tyrant on circles, which is a computer wants to make everything round, right?
Yeah, and that was, everybody does. So even when we got in early with the modeling team, it was something, even though when you look at it, it might seem obvious, I think the brain is trained to want to fix those imperfections. And so that's something we had to kind of work through with the departments to make sure that, no, those are the things we want. And there's a fine line between breaking it and balancing it. So that was something we worked on for quite a while to get right.
And grounding that perspective. So while there's wonkiness, it still sort of felt real, right? In terms of
Yeah, you had to be able to point the camera and still get a sense that this is a believable place. You know, it may not be a realistic place, but it's a believable place. You know, and then again, like the density of texture within a silhouette, a strong silhouette, is something that's very iconic to Sasak's work as well. So again, you know, we started to play with that in our characters, and we use that in our set and prop design as well. So we have these simple, iconic silhouettes that are very densely packed with these rich textures.
You can kind of see that in the suit of armor, which doesn't really get a lot of play in the movie, but it, like the attention to detail, I always really loved the comedy of this and how.
Yeah, and it was a reflection of, you know, the Willoughby design choices of the family and the characters. And so, you know, the skeleton of this thing is rail thin, and it's built out to make it seem bigger than it really is, which I think is what Tim's trying to do as well.
Yeah. It's like, you know, probably what, 3'5", like, you know, like there's a little guy. One of the big influences, I think, for me very early on was like illustrating the movie kind of from my hometown. So I grew up in London, Ontario, Canada, the other London, and it's an old English sort of settled place, and so there was all these old Victorian homes that were kind of around where the studio was. And so one of the things that sort of felt like it was working in our concept art was when we started to bring in that sort of feeling of those Victorian homes that are a little neglected, like that sort of feeling of it being forgotten felt right. So it was slightly different than Up, where you got the sense that the character and the space was resisting change. It's almost like they just forgot to leave, and they didn't know the world changed. They just sort of, you know, it's like a frog in boiling water. They just, one day went out and it's like, where'd the sky go? And then went back home. Like they didn't, as opposed to it being like an overt sort of motivated act of resistance, right, Kyle?
Yeah, and the house is such an important character in the film, especially to sort of the trap that it is to the kids and the family itself. So while it's a warm, kind of inviting place, there's change, as Kris said, happening around them, and ultimately you want the kids to get out. You want them to escape the traps of this. It's beautiful and colorful, but it's starting to kind of grow in and grow over them. And so that's something we really wanted to get through, sort of that magic garden sensibility.
I think you can see it in the trees, right? Just sort of how they have that strong shape language.
Yeah, pushing again, you know, trying to find areas and opportunities to do that. It's these clean, simple silhouettes with these sort of densely packed inner details and textures, you know, and then this idea of what if things weren't made of what they really are, but we found something that was close that could feel like that. But if you were to make this at home, what would you use? So rice paper became something we used a lot for the leaves and a lot of things, and ribbon for grass. And, you know, we started to look at beads for little berries, and pushing the scale of the real world and these characters within it gave us this kind of macro miniature sense of the lens and from the cat's point of view. So all of this stuff started to come together, and it felt really, really fresh and new and rich. And it felt like we were really starting to hit the tone in a way that harmonized with the story and sort of elevated everything, and then could inspire a story that could then inspire design and back and forth.
I really love the idea of it's like a secret garden, but it's also a prison. So like, you know, while 2/3 of the movie you're in this space, like I as a kid, I'd want to be there, but I also like understand that when it comes down, it's the right thing. Like they need to be sort of shoved out of it to grow. And so some of these, like as you took that into the house, like I think all of that sort of construction started to really kind of inform itself, right, Kyle?
Yeah, and these were some of the first designs that I did, some of the first paintings. That painting of the sitting room there, I was just trying to kind of find a personality here. You know, we had mom and dad's chair, and the idea was like the room was split into their two sides. This is where they spent all their time, yet they didn't necessarily share a common kind of language. So trying to explore some of that stuff we eventually put into the entirety of the house started to find itself here.
What a view. And then one of the things actually early on, there's a museum in London called the Eldon House, which is a Victorian family, and they bequeathed all of their stuff to the city. And it always struck me as funny in a kind of a dark way that, you know, one of the symbols of success was like dead things on the walls and like, you know, the kind of collections of this colonial family, and yet I didn't really get the sense that they actually liked or loved each other. They just sort of had a lot of stuff that they gathered. And so we kind of wanted to take that into this world, right, Kyle? Like in terms of how
and just fill this, you know, there's too much stuff in this house. It's gross. And just, you know, it's this idea of this, nothing's been thrown away, this idea of neglect, but yet, you know, these are trophies. These are what it means to be a hero, or these are what it means to be great in Tim's eyes.
100 years ago, somebody came home with an oarfish that wouldn't fit, so they put it on 3 walls, right?
Cut it into 3, make it fit. We'll just make it work for the room.
These early sketches really kind of just, I think, give us a sense of how lived in the space was, right? In terms of,
yeah. And, you know, it was a bit of a museum, the idea being that it was so almost frozen in time. And then when we get up to the kids' room upstairs, you know, this started out as this was the place where all the kids lived, but ultimately we boiled it down to this is where the twins live and build and create and imagine.
Kind of their internet.
It's their internet, exactly, and it's sort of, they built this playground for themselves out of all of these books. So the kids, we had this idea early on that, you know, these are kids raised by books, and so that's where a lot of their information has come from, and they've been shut off. So we wanted to get that idea through.
And then like the texture, sort of the richness of that world was something you were always really passionate about, right?
Yeah, and we've touched on this a little bit, you know, here and there. And again, it just came down to scale and this idea of using watercolor and washes and staining and these kinds of these imperfections to kind of give a grit and an earthiness to the set, as well as, you know, these oversized, this oversized scale. And then if you, again, like I said, if you were to make this by hand, you know, what materials would you use? And if these were sort of 9-inch dolls, a lot of your materials would feel oversized. The weaves would be bigger, the materials would be bigger. And so that's something we really wanted to make sure that came through. And this idea was something that I wanted to get in, but we never actually made it. And the idea was to develop a shader that we could use on our environments and our props that would kind of rough up the edges of it and give us a sort of a dry brush kind of feel to everything. And it's a missed opportunity, but ultimately I'm still, you know, really happy with where things landed with everything else in play. But I think this would have capped everything off really nicely, but maybe there's a place for it.
Next movie.
Right.
Yeah. But you talk about like, in terms of like the references and sort of like how, you know, while we're not kind of, you know, judging other people's, you know, efforts in different films, like there's just things that felt right and things that sort of felt wrong in terms of trying to make sure the world harmonized, right, Kyle?
Yeah, it was just about committing to the idea, you know, and committing to it 100% across all avenues. We couldn't just push our characters and then have a more realistic feeling, you know, environments or lighting or effects. You know, we wanted to go all the way with it. So that was where, you know, a lot of the stuff in the style guide was trying to be informative of. And this is just sort of explaining how to build up those layers, you know, for our surfacing artists and our designers to give, to sort of achieve that look. So starting with a clean slate, laying in your wash, then you put a hand-drawn texture to that in a graphic way, and then we light it. And so that's the approach we took for getting a lot of these looks.
And it kept the imperfections present in a way that whether the audience picks up on it or not, it's there through the whole film, right?
And whether, you know, despite it being made on a computer, it still started by hand. All those textures were made by hand, and that was fed into it. So it still had that human handmade touch to it. And then with this, you know, you're starting to see a lot of, this is just another example of materials and textures we use in place of their real world look. And, you know, cold pressed styrofoam became bricks and rocks and all kinds of things. So there's a lot of choices here that once we had the groundwork laid, you know, it was easy to just start laying it into all the elements of the film.
But what about the world outside? I mean, this is an early concept piece from Robin Joseph, and right after sort of like reading the book and starting to break the script, I love the idea that this was a back east city. So whether it's Chicago or Boston or Pittsburgh or New York, Toronto, like we wanted to kind of get that sort of feeling of a city with a lot of density and a lot of history. And I really loved this art, but it didn't quite feel right for the style of our show. So when Kyle came in, you started to kind of push forward this idea of this miniature world, right?
Yeah. And again, balance is key here. We couldn't, if we made everything small but the same ratio, it wouldn't feel small. So we had to, this mixture of big and little, and making those choices where we felt would give us the impact that we needed. And again, more inspiration, just looking at ways we could, textures and the look of it. This idea was more about distance to camera and trying to fake a lot of that stuff and get an illustrative feel in terms of detail. So anything that was further away just became silhouettes, and we stripped detail out of it. And the
you see that in Aaron. This is Aaron Spurgeon did these, right?
Yeah. So this was an idea where the Normans and the mid-ground there, denser textures, and then as we move back, we simplify things.
But as you started to kind of throw it into your style guide, you wanted to kind of have that sense of like different types of buildings sort of populating this world, right?
Yeah, but in a contained way, in a limited way. We still wanted the Willoughby house to be the thing that felt iconic in this space. So while we were pushing a lot of the silhouettes, the buildings, a lot of them were repetitive, but scale was really important. We wanted to feel that change, and that the world had moved on without them and sort of forgotten about them, and we're building new on top of old, and cities progress as they do. And so we wanted to get that sense of that believability into the city itself.
Ultimately, the story is about these kids that are resisting running away from home to grow up. And as the film goes towards the completion of their arc, they have their road trip. And Kyle, you were talking really early on that as they get closer to, I think, where the movie wants them to go, we reward them with color and actually whimsy, right? So the idea was always going to be like a kid's book, right?
I really wanted that moment. I wanted a moment in the film where we could just open up color, turn the taps on, and just experience what these kids are feeling for this first time, being out on this journey and seeing the world in this way. So it became really important to me to find that, go inside of a Sasek book essentially, and have a moment where we could do that. And from then on, we kept it open. Once they're outside, that color is there, and they've accepted it.
And so it was for the kids and the parents, right? Basically, like any of the characters that broke out of the house, we wanted to reward them with this sort of.
Yeah, and I think you really feel it, as an audience watching it. We were restrained, and we had little hints when Ruth shows up and Annie shows up, and then they go to Melanov's. But ultimately, we kept retreating back to the house until this moment when the kids finally leave, and then we kept it open.
I always felt this illustration of the elf felt like a golden book, like it had that, like it was really committed to, I think, in terms of the whimsy of it, right? Yeah. And now, while all this story and design stuff was happening, we were discovering how the movie would move, as in how we would animate. And I'm just going to run through this pretty quick, but one of the early concepts, and this is really a 2D idea, is like variable frame exposure. So it's, instead of shooting things on ones, we would pull frames to try to get the film to feel a little more handmade. So the comparative bouncing the ball here is like, on the left, we have it splined on ones, and on the right, it's on twos and threes. And as you start to see it sort of move through space, you can see how the eye can sort of follow the animation on twos. And very, even simple tests like this, this is pre having designed, but our animators were playing around with just how much can we get out of timing and out of very simple choices with silhouette. Actually, I think this test led us to committing to the idea that the twins didn't blink, right? Even though probably too much squash and stretch. And from Andrew's test here to Anikit's, one of our animators who has strong 2D skills, you can kind of see the anatomy doesn't really squash and stretch. All of the cartooning is in the poses. And Kyle, you kind of carried that through as you worked over the animators' work. So this conversation of design and style was really active all the way through, right?
Yeah, push it till it breaks and then pull back, and so once it starts to not feel like the character anymore, you've gone too far. And I think this was really helpful for the animators to kind of see what the limits were, and then they could play within that and push it themselves. But ultimately we found this ground that we were really happy with.
And it's like a nice level of squash and stretch, but like the characters feeling like toys that are grounded in that way, right? So like the general guidelines were always, kind of graphic posing, character of the moment, pose-to-pose animation, and fewer frames without losing information. And we can really see how this evolution unfolded. And I like to always kind of run through a case study of our villains, the parents. And the idea is like, these are kind of rotten people, and we wanted to hang on to what was really subversive and fun from the book. So early on, like Pete Oswald was playing with them being maybe, old fashioned in the way like, Prince Philip or, Samantha Bee, and I think it was Gary Cooper, I can't remember.
Clark Gable, I think.
Oh, Clark Gable, that's what it was. Yeah. But then Kyle, you were kind of pushing it like in terms of like maybe they walk around in like safari clothes and chaps and stuff, even though they don't have a horse.
I think I was thinking more British, but I again, like what's iconic about these characters and what can we push, and then the great Craig Kelman again, just went as far as we could possibly go. And there's so many great choices here. It was really difficult to sort of nail down where we wanted to go until we hit this design here. And I think this made us laugh more than any of the others, but it also felt like, this feels right. This feels like the right balance of absurdity, but believability. And so that was a really
as domesticated as a human can be, like almost like she's stopped breathing through her nose, and she's just sort of like this sort of Q-tip, and that's sort of
the dad, right?
Yeah, no, one of the things we always wanted to make sure they felt innocent. We wanted to make sure they were stuck in a state of arrested development. So this idea that they had mood swings that were broader than the kids, that they were more childish than the kids. And there was an idea in the book too that they were so madly in love with each other, they didn't have any left over for their own children. So the idea that they were funny was super important. And we needed the rigs to get there. And so this is an early rig test of Father, just to kind of, again, we're just learning here at this point, and some of the stuff is a little noodly and disturbing to watch, but it was really helpful, I think, to sort of see the animators play with these rigs and sort of see what we could get out of them. And as you can see, I'll just play the next, look at this one. Yeah, so trying to get to those Kelman design shapes. Before we even had the character designs, we started to play with these geometries, like very simple shapes. And one of the animators came up with the idea that maybe mom's knees are kind of locked together with the dress. And that became this really interesting affectation of their love. This sort of idea that they're very, very affected, more affected than the kids are in terms of their relationship to each other. Eric Burnett's one of our animators, and so this is one of the very early tests. He just sort of went off and did this, and it was delightful on very early rigs on Father.
They call him Flipper, faster than lightning, flying there under. They call him Flipper, faster than lightning, flying there under.
So some of that stuff is like maybe too broad, too cartoony, but it was helpful to see it. And certainly working with mom's hair was a big like kind of balancing thing. And you can see as we go to the final shots in the film, that cartooning was really committed to, and we kept them in the parents, and the parents were actually broader than the kids. And I think that gave us a way to kind of like them, even though they were bad people. This is a shot progression reel, which I think is really interesting to sort of see how our team was working. This is blocking. And then once it's splined with the frames pulled out, it was really important that we kept that what was working in the 2D is maintained as we go through 3D. So as you see it all lit, the shape language of the flailing limbs, it holds up, and we commit to it. So the other thing that sort of completed the picture was certainly our effects. And this reel we built, and I'll just let Kyle talk over it just in terms of how we attacked the harmonizing of that to the world of the Willoughbys.
Yeah, well, the effects weren't a huge part of this film. They were still important, and we needed some. So again, looking at our handmade influences and starting to think about those same texture ideas, the same graphic shape, using rice paper to build fire, and then with the animation, like how much could we get away with? How limited could we be? Sat there to support it, but it didn't overpower the scene. And so everything started with these 2D approaches, 2D principles, blocking it out, building our timing and our design language, and then building it by hand in 3D and taking frame by frame, building that geometry, and then texturing, surfacing, and coloring it. So again, those principles, all the 2D and handmade stuff still applied here. And there was a lot of challenges with that, specifically when we got to looking at water. This is a great smoke test that our effects lead Helium had done.
Also love like the off timing of effects with animation. It sort of makes it feel like you rolled the camera back and shot at a different exposure.
This is a progression again. We're just starting with the geo and then adding our texture and then color and our last passes.
Yeah, water was a big challenge because it's easy to make water look too real.
Yeah, and again, we couldn't put these characters just in simple water. So this idea of mylar strips and building the water out of that became something we got excited about, but also presented one of the biggest challenges of the film, because when you need to splash that, you need to break that up. And how can we make that look real and believable without it looking really weird? So it took a while to get this right. And then I think we finally landed on something that you almost don't really notice in the film, which is kind of what you want from your effects when they're used in this way. Unless they're a key part of the scene, you kind of want them to sit back and support. So we were really happy with where we landed on these.
And of course, it all pulls together with the most important element of the film is color and lighting, right?
That's right. So with color and lighting, we were looking at our main influences being Bernie Fuchs and Tadahiro, and I'm sure everybody is familiar with Tadahiro, maybe not so much Bernie, but for me, these are two of my favorite artists, and there's a lot they have in common, even though their styles are quite different. Tadahiro is really about using value and composition. Bernie Fuchs also, whereas Bernie uses light in a bit more of a rendered 3D way. Tadahiro uses light in a very graphic way. So what I wanted to do is find a balance, merge these two influences together and find a balance where value was the most important thing to get across, using light and dark and color and contrast to create, carve out our characters in our space, give them room for performance, and we should always be able to track them. And then lighting is really just about shaping our characters and our bringing our textures and those kinds of things to life. So that was really important. So, and then they both use film effects, light bloom and haze and things like that. So all of these elements were what kind of influenced the look of our lighting and color. And you can see here in these frames, these are some early concepts done where we started to apply this into our design. And I think once we hit this, it felt really good in terms of the balance of the outside world and how all that color could live together.
This was like 2016, right? So this was sort of the world where we were looking at this kind of lighting very popular in animation, right?
Yeah, when you talk about contrast, there's people might have different views of what that means, but for me, it wasn't necessarily about black and white and bright light and a shadowed color. It was really about how stop motion does it, where you can still get graphic shapes in your lighting, you can still get hard shadows, and you can still have there's not a lot of gradient and roll off to the shadow, but there's still a grounding to it. So we wanted to make sure that form was still present, that things didn't flatten out. And really it was about, it wasn't, we moved away from naturalistic lighting and went more theatrical with our look, so that it was really about highlighting performance and, taking the eye of the audience and putting it exactly where we wanted it to be so that they weren't wandering the screen. And then you see here some examples of kind of how that came together in some shots. throughout the
I
film.
mean, I definitely feel it, especially like in the twins' hair and in the clouds, like how, like, you know, the texture comes forward, even though the color is really committed to it, doesn't step on it, right?
Yeah, and having a controlled palette, you know, and it was about mood, and it was about, again, about tone, and not throwing every color of the rainbow at it, but being very controlled with it, which leads us into the color script. You know, building this, I think we maybe built 4 or 5 of these over the course of how the story developed and changed. You know, there was different offshoots of sequences that we explored, but ultimately I think you can kind of feel the tapestry of color and the mood ring, as Kris likes to call it, the shift of the color as the emotion in the film shifts. And so here were some early, you know, color scripts and then translations into the actual film. And I was pretty proud of how we kept pretty close to what we were aiming for. You know, obviously camera and plays a little bit of part in that, but again, working closely with Kris from the very beginning and just sort of talking about composition and how important that was, and sort of a locked camera, and, you know, designing to camera allowed us to make these really graphic choices, and get that illustrative feel out of a lot of this stuff. So you can see we start very subdued and autumnal with the Willoughbys, home and the Willoughby family as we're dealing with them, and then as the mood starts to shift and the emotions start to peak and valley, we introduced color. And even in the valleys and the low points, we still wanted color to be present. We didn't want to just go desaturated and suck out all the color and get cool, you know. We wanted to make sure that, you know, for instance, when the kids are taken, that color becomes, it shifts to a sort of an eerie, unsettling space, but it's still saturated, it's still prevalent.
And that's kind of our show. That's everything. I think we showed you everything. So, any questions?
That was amazing, guys. Seriously, that was a lot of information. Thank you very much for sharing all that.
Thank you for letting us.
Not at all. Okay, so I'm gonna kick it off with some questions, and to everyone here, go ahead and type in some questions as well, and I'll pick and choose a few. Let's see here. How much of the story was developed in the boarding stage versus like the script and writing stage?
It was sort of happening all through our process. So, you know, the analogy I always like to kind of use with the animation is, it's like, you know, when you get your locked, or your quote unquote locked draft of a script and you start storyboarding, it's basically like being on a boat leaving the old world, and everybody's cheering and celebrating. And then, you know, when you get about a mile into the water, they start shooting cannonballs at you. And that's really the audience, you know? And so, you know, by the time you get to the new world, if you have a single board from that original script, you're lucky.
Yeah.
You know, because you're kind of rebuilding the boat as you're going. Now, I like, my process is very writer's room. So as Kyle said at the beginning of our pitch, like it's a conversation that evolves as the movie changes. So like we were always trying to get to that place where we were call and response with an audience. And so early audience for me was always the crew. And then at some point you show the crew the film in a different context and you get their response. And then at some point you have to try to get the crew's family in, because you want people who've never seen it and are invested and care about the work on the screen. And then you show it to strangers. And like all that process, to me, it's like stand up. It's very much like a calibrating, you know, over the course of many years. And I think when you're adapting a book too, I mean, the challenge was always, you know, what to keep and what to sacrifice for the sake of the medium shift. And I think our process of constant screenings, and then after every screening, I would reread or re-listen to the book so it was fresh in my head. And so that kind of push and pull of what we were making, how the audience was receiving it, and then what was the source material, that was a 3.5-year process. So certainly storyboarding was like at some point, you know, more valuable than the words on a page, because you use the tools that are more relevant. And then there's a point where, you know, when I've got all my assets built and we've got sets, I would sit with camera, like me, Kyle, and Sebastian, our DOP, and we would solve problems there. So we'd even go around story. It's really about efficiency and trying to riff or trying to iterate. So whatever tools you need to use, you use.
And you said how long was the development process from the time that you, I guess, got greenlit to it on being, you know, on screen?
Yeah, I started in 2016. Kyle, when did you come on? Was it 2016 or 2017? You came
September 2016. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it was about 4 years because we finished. What was it February 28th of the year 2020? Because we were in Toronto. We did the last color timing and sound mix, and then I flew to Vancouver, packed up my apartment, and moved to LA 4 days before the world shut down. I had no idea there was even a pandemic, about to happen. They don't announce that stuff. So we literally got it done, I think, on the 11th hour of like the world shifting, right, Kyle?
Yeah.
It was weird.
It was a weird time for sure. Absolutely.
I'll get to that. I'll ask another COVID-related question soon. But real quick on the characters, it's kind of like a couple of questions here. Sort of, how do you know when a character design is ready for animation? And a similar question is, what advice would you give on building strong character designs?
I mean, I think, Kyle, do you want to speak to, I think, the psychology? I mean, Craig always talks about, like, he always has little stories for like what he's choosing. And often I never receive that when you look at it cold, but then when you talk to him, he's getting under the skin, right? He's sort of.
Yeah, it really is about a story. It's about the personality of the character. A design should tell a story. I think anybody looking at a design should understand what that character's about, what kind of personality that character might have. And a lot of that, can come from silhouette or it can come from clothing or, things like that. And I think you don't necessarily know when it's done. I think it's a bit of a gut check. Making a film is a collaborative process, and I think there are varied opinions about that. I think it's just at some point you just trust your instincts, and when it feels right and everybody in the room sort of feels like you're on the same page, then you can call it done. I think you could work on designs forever. I think anybody that's an artist knows it's always hard to say it's done. It's never really done. It's just, am I content with where this is, and does it answer all the questions that I set out to answer for myself when I started this journey and I started to explore this design? And if I've done that, then I think to the best of my ability, I've done that job, and I've developed a character that does everything it's going to need to do. And
I'm a big fan of casting too, and I think like how a lineup works, how silhouettes play off of each other. Like if you look at like live action and sort of like how when a casting director makes their choices, like it's about that chemistry. And I think we're hunting for that too. And I think that push and pull of that first record is often somewhat sacrificial. Like there's a lot of just finding characters through drawings, animation, and voice. And until you get all of those elements sort of put together in a package, the trick is actually keeping an escape hatch sort of there. Like, do you know what I mean? And I often feel like, the trick is like trusting your casting, but always giving yourself room to, pivot if it's feeling wrong. And I think sometimes it's hard when you're staring at it really close to have that, honesty. But I think, and I do think that's why when you take a medium and flip it, so when you've been looking at drawings for a long time and then go to voice, that really helps my brain sort of get back from, what we think is true, and really sort of see if what we're learning is harmonizing. And
I think that was Nanny's journey. I think she was one of the hardest characters to sort of lock down, and she had probably the most iterations. And I think casting really helped eventually to inform her design, whereas that wasn't necessarily the case for the other characters. But I think it really helped when Maya came on board, and that influence sort of found its way into the design. That was super helpful.
Yeah, it was a big, I remember when I first recorded Martin Short, like I was very excited because I grew up in Canada and loved SCTV, and Martin was like, a hero of mine, and I had never met him. And so he has a cottage up in Northern Ontario, kind of middle of nowhere. So we went up to this, it was a hotel. It was really sketchy. It was a hotel, and the engineer had taken the bed mattresses off and made a little bed fort. And Martin came in, and we sat and we chatted, and he was like, I'll try 3 different characters. And he walked into the bed fort, and I couldn't see him because I was on the other side of the room. And then he just started doing things. And I don't know how he, like when he did that throat gurgle, that to me became the character. And I, again, it was nothing that we had thought of. It was nothing that we had premeditated, but like, I don't know how he got there, but like, you know, you just have to trust that process. And to me, those happy accidents are necessary. And then that actually fed into this idea of the long throat, and that these guys are kind of like, they don't chew their food, and they kind of have this, undulating sort of bird-like quality where they can mate, like show signs of mating rituals with sound. And, you know, certainly none of that we thought of. It was Martin. So I think it's a really cool process. And I think, again, it's all about being able to get to the phases where you put 2 or 3 things together and then commit your choice. That's important.
Yes. So kind of related to this, how do you, as a director, you're working on your movie, you have your original vision, you've seen it so many times and many iterations. How do you keep from becoming stale? Like, how do you keep the film fresh for yourself?
I think you can't. I think the first thing you have to admit is that you're fallible. And, certainly I think one of the biggest enemies of the creative process is where you get calcified and defensive, or if ego gets too much in the way. So sometimes admitting that I've seen this too much and I've lost my perspective is the thing that makes what I think leadership in a way that allows the movie to get better. And then that takes me to, kind of another analogy. It's like the trick to a long marriage is don't fall in love at the same time. And I think making a movie is kind of like that. So like there are moments where I think I was losing faith, but then Kyle would be doing something in design that would then inspire me, or Fiona, the lead editor, she would see an angle where I wasn't, because I was staring too long at the sun. And I think that's why you have a crew, and that's why a writer's room process, whether it is literally using your story team or your animation team, like that ability for the crew to dialogue with you, and their feeling of safety in that space. I think that allows you to be a human when you're staring at something for 4 years. Does that make sense?
No, definitely. This is for both of you guys. If you had to have dinner with one of the characters, who would you choose and why?
Kyle, do you want to start?
Probably Jane. I think I would pick Jane. I think we're probably very similar. So that, and maybe that's, I think Jane for sure.
What would you eat? I don't know, my brain went to spaghetti. I think because of the long hair. Soup, yeah. I probably want to hang out with Tim, because I think I like you were saying, Kyle, how you're very much like Jane. I'm the oldest of three boys, and I wasn't the best big brother by any stretch of the imagination. Like I think hanging out with this fallible character and giving him some life advice would be fun. I think I'd eat soup with him. Yeah, soup is a good Tim food.
Soup all around. Soup for the table.
What specifically about this story drove you to, what inspired you to do this story as opposed to some of the other projects that you may have had in the works?
I mean, I like that it was a human story, and I like that it was there's a lot of movies where you have your protagonist is loved and then they lose their parents and they become the trope of an orphan in a world that actually a lot of doors open for them because they're pretty and because they can sing or because they have a magical power. And I really wanted to tell a story of like an animated fable about children that weren't loved, because I think that's the reality. And I think there's a hopeful sort of through line of we all deserve happiness, and and this is my point of view. I don't think this is necessarily true, but I do think we all deserve to belong. And I think telling that story of these kids that are in a tough situation but are optimistic about it felt really opening in terms of something fun to play with and something different. And I really like the fact that we could commit to that in a way that other films wouldn't lend itself to. I mean, we have 3 endings, and I think the idea of it, like the film, not taking itself seriously to allow us to be really creative, but then underneath the tone of the film, we are talking about serious things. And so like in the first ending where Tim is making his pitch to the parents to love him and to love the other kids, there's a real sadness to that compromise. And I wanted half the audience to be angry at us that we were doing this, and while it's like the right thing for the kids to say we shouldn't murder our parents, we wanted it to be like, that's the wrong couple, that's the wrong parent. And when the kids, you know, end up correcting their mistake, instead of getting rewarded, you know, they end up alone on the side of an Alp, and they have to sort of make that really hard choice to just choose each other. And I think that allowed us to have our kind of independent Canadian film ending where everybody dies in a snowbank. And of course, the film ends as a sitcom. And that idea of like, you know, telling your emotions and sort of letting your fear, you know, not stop you from whatever the truth is that you want to present. That to me is growing up. And so it was a riff on the coming of age story, which I really was drawn to. And you know, my daughters are 20 and 18 now, and you know, they're weird kids, and I love them for their weirdness. And I really love the idea of a story of like kind of like kids forced to, you know, solve their problems independently again. And I think that all of that sort of felt fun and you know, exciting to play with. So, yeah.
You mentioned earlier 3 different endings. I'd love to, if you can expand on that. Can you tell us what some of the other endings were?
Well, no, they're all in the movie. So weirdly enough, that's like one of those story ideas that stuck pretty quick. I mean, early on, like actually, we didn't really talk about this today, but like when I was developing the set of the house with Kyle and Sebastian, our DOP, we always talked about it being a sitcom. So I grew up in the 80s and I loved, you know, Roseanne and Cheers and, you know, Three's Company. And I love the idea that this is like a sitcom with this weird sort of, you know, Grey Gardens family. And so all of our camera language was really designed to kind of mimic that. So it's like a sitcom without a laugh track. So I wanted to end the movie as a sitcom. So really like that last scene where Jane gets a mustache and the twins get a mustache and Nanny's got a mustache and Tim doesn't have a mustache. Like that's an episode of Roseanne. It was shot at the dinner table with everybody on the same side. And so we knew that really early on. But then the film also had a cinematic, you know, side to it. So every time they left the house, they were in a movie. And so I wanted to embrace that collision of the two worlds. And so that was something that we really, you know, had fairly early and protected, because, you know, it was a tricky needle to thread trying to get that to work. But Kyle, do you want anything in there from your side?
No, I mean, I think you covered it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I got a question for you, Kyle. This is one from the audience. What is the difference between a production designer and a visual development artist? I know this may be different in different studios, but what is it to you?
I mean, ultimately, the production designer is responsible in a similar way that the director is responsible for sort of the overall look of the film. So they need to cover everything from design right through to lighting. And whereas, you know, a visual development artist helps that process. So they, you know, they sort of get the orders, if you will, from the production designer, and they go off, and it's their ideas that, you know, are feeding back into informing a lot of the choices. So that relationship is really important, and I don't believe in a sort of a dictatorship. Similar to Kris has that writing room. To me, I like to sort of lay a groundwork, but then just enough to leave it open to allow the artist to explore and bring their ideas into it, and not just say, we're doing this and you go off and execute it and tell me when it's done. So, and then in between those two, often, and not always, we didn't on this particular project, but in between those two, you would have an art director. So generally you would have production designer kind of overseeing the overall scope of the film and creating that look. And then the art director sort of takes that and carries that through each department and makes sure that we're being consistent and that message is being fed as it moves down the chain of production. So there's those sort of three facets that come together to build a really strong team, in my opinion.
From my perspective, I mean, I think casting the production designer is key to the success of a film. Like, I think, and like the story about me and Kyle, like, when did we meet, Kyle? Was it 2001?
2000.
or 2000?
Yeah, I mean, I was my first year at Sheridan College, and you were my character design teacher in first year.
When I was like, you know, I think 25, so I was barely, you know, it was sort of like, you know, a kid teaching kids, and we were all kind of contemporary. But it's amazing how those relationships from, you know, that experience sort of, you know, grew and maintained over 20 years. So we've known each other for about, you know, at the time, I guess it was about 16 years or so, and you know, so there's a lot of trust there, and then there's a lot of kind of shorthand. And I think for a lot of the movie, I mean, you were kind of working in an independent fashion to sort of like own that side of the film, and I think you have to have trust to be able to, I think, create harmony, and that was important. That production designer has autonomy, and
absolutely.
you know,
I think, you know, you need to be free to focus on story and writing and all the things you have going on, being your own head of story, you know, edit, and you're dealing with that side of things. And so one of the biggest parts of my job as a production designer is to get inside your head, understand, you know, what your vision is, what your aim is, and then take that and say, all right, I can run with this, and earn that trust to be able to work independently, allow you to focus on what you're focusing and not have to worry or micromanage on the side of design, and know that your vision is being brought to life on that side of things. And you know, sometimes there's choices that are made, and you know, we'll get into a review, and you have opinions, obviously, and things can change. But ultimately, I think it was a pretty smooth process on this one, which was really it was great for me to have that autonomy and that independence. You know, it was my second film, and so it was nice to just have that trust. And ultimately, I would say we had that kind of across the board. So we made it. There was a lot of choices that we made that we may not have gotten away with, you know, had another studio been making this film.
Yep, Deliverance. You know, guy playing a banjo in a pizza box. I don't know how that got through.
When you read the book, what did you get to work with the author at all, or like what was the relationship with like? Did you consult each other?
Honestly, not so much through the process. I mean, I think, you know, the nature of what we do is anybody who's made an animated movie, you know, it's not pretty. Like, it's like raising a kid. You know, there's a lot of you know, poop on the walls at the beginning, and then it gets awkward and rebellious, and it's, you know, got pimples and it's yelling at you, I hate you, Dad. And then at the end, you know, it starts to come together as an adult. And I think that ugly process is a hard thing for, I don't know if an author would enjoy seeing that through line. So like early on, you know, there were conversations with Lois in terms of what, you know, what her values were around the story, and it was important to understand that. And then towards the end of our process, we shared the movie with her before it was finished, and it was really awesome to sort of, you know, again, use her not in a way that's, you know, meant to be subversive or anything, but just as an audience, you know, somebody who, you know, is invested and cares, but we're showing you something different. What do you like? What are you bumping on? And we had great conversations with her, and she was really supportive. And I think there were moments where I was maybe, as happens, like I think I was losing some, you know, confidence about how we were treating the parents in terms of their villain through line. And it was Lois that said that she loved how creepy and how, you know, kind of, you know, hot tubby they were. I shouldn't use that word, but like how creepy in love they were, and how we didn't soften them. We sort of, you know, kept what was really kind of pushed in her story. So I think that to me was a really great canary in the coal mine for, you know, our confidence in the last year of production. So yeah, it was great. It was a great relationship, I think, all the way through.
Nice. Being one of the first original animated films from Netflix, what was your experience? How was this experience sort of different, or just what was your experience like compared to working in prior studios?
I mean, we were an independent film for about a year and a half, so we had a lot of production that was kind of in place by the time we made our relationship with Netflix formal. But I mean, to be really kind of, it's probably not a terribly satisfying answer, but like when Netflix came on board, I was really comforted by, you know, the fact that it was, there's that kind of responsibility you get in the studio culture, and the people running the Netflix animation division. I'd worked with them at other studios, DreamWorks and ODW, and there's a shorthand there, and there's a reason things are made the way they're made, and I think there was a confidence that really sort of bolstered us when we had that sort of studio support. And so early on, like on the logistical side, and Kyle, you can sort of weigh in on this, like I felt like Netflix came in with a lot of support for our film in terms of making sure that we had what we needed to get it onto the screen. And they challenged the story in a way that was necessary and made the movie better. But I don't think, there was never any moment where, we had to water down the intent of the film for the sake of the audience that was on the other side of the Netflix brand. And I think that was a very unique thing. And I think because, we were telling a weird story about this sort of weird family, and it was a children's movie with children protagonists. Like there's a lot of things that are, kind of tricky when you're looking at a 4-quadrant, $100 million, big budget tentpole blockbuster film. So our pressure was different. And again, I'm kind of careful when I'm saying here, because it's not necessarily that we weren't pressured to make the best version of this movie, but the commitment to make this movie wasn't, it never waffled. In fact, I remember an early design meeting where Melissa and Greg came up, and Kyle, you showed them, like we showed them all of the art for the movie, and it was awesome. They just liked it. And that's very rare, I think, in that sort of, confidence that they understood what Kyle was doing and what that team was doing. And I think, Kyle, do you want to weigh in on that?
That's for me, that's the first thing I noticed right away. I don't have big studio experience. I've worked at smaller studios and independent studios who are making a film for bigger studios. So the relationship's a little bit different, but on this one, the thing I noticed right away was that supportive mentality. There was no agenda when Netflix came in. There was, I wouldn't necessarily call it pressure. There was, like Kris said, there was, they wanted to make this film, and, we had to make this film and get it done. But at the same time, there was so much support around that and so much freedom that they sort of sat back and let us make that film without influencing and coming in telling us the film that they wanted us to make, because it fit within their sort of umbrella of style or the types of films they wanted to make at Netflix. Whereas, as we're learning, their whole thing is to be it's diversity and creator driven content. So that was hugely freeing to know that we had that support and we could make weird choices and we could play around with things. I don't know if we would have gotten away with those character designs at another bigger studio. I think, that we would have gotten notes about appeal, and we would have gotten notes about, can we sell this? There's other things that go along with making a film at some of those studios. Whereas at Netflix, the agenda is just to make a good film and tell a good story. And that was great, especially at the time when they came in. There was maybe some uncertainty, just, we were making this film, but we didn't know yet where it was going to land. And I think when they came in, it just sort of, it was a bit of you could relax and breathe a little bit easier.
And it was a solid collaboration. I think, this tone is a tricky tone, like in terms of writing, the subversive comedy, it could tip into mean pretty accidentally. And so I think, the steady hand of, again, those screenings, and then how we collaborated with the partners over there in terms of making the best version of this movie. It was great. It was great. And they were consistent in terms of that sort of pressure in the right way. So yeah, I think, the headline for me isn't that it's like complete freedom necessarily, but it is, the right kind of pressure to make a good movie. And that was our experience in terms of that collaboration.
Luckily you guys dodged COVID, but it did release during COVID, the height of the lockdown. How has COVID affected your release, and how is it affecting you guys now?
Well, I'm home and have to be.
All the time.
Yeah. It's weird. Like, I mean, it's like, at the end of the day, when we were making this movie, we once we partnered with Netflix, we knew that our audience was going to be home. Like, that was the aim for it. We did a theatrical print. We have a theatrical mix, and I think the saddest thing, which is, I even hesitate to say it because in the grand scheme of the world, it's not that big a deal. Like I wish we had that opportunity to sit in a dark room with a bunch of strangers and see how they reacted to what we made. And I think that was the only real logistical thing that was sort of compromised with COVID, because ultimately I think once the algorithm pushes the button, you're reaching an audience around the world that is dynamic and diverse, and it's sort of like it's day and date everywhere, and it's really, it's a little humbling and kind of weird, especially when you're home on your couch watching it happen, because you can't go anywhere. So I don't know. I think April was an interesting time in the pandemic too. Really the lockdown started in March, so I think people were still in the novelty of what it was like to be home. So there was sort of like, it was a good time for a funny movie. I think if we were 2 months later, I don't know if we would have, found as much of a connection to the audience as we did in that time slot. But you can't premeditate any of that stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
So there was intention to have it in the theaters originally? Just
a small run in the way that Netflix has done it with other properties that they've put out. But, yeah. Let's see. And as far as life now, I like working in animation. I think I've been social distancing for 45 years, so once I get used to it, like, it's kind of okay. I miss people, but Kyle, do you miss people, or are you okay?
I do. I think I did a lot of freelance work for a long time and worked from home, and I ultimately what drove me away from that was wanting to be back in a space with people to collaborate, especially on something like this. It's things often, a lot of choices and ideas come from, sat around the lunch table or whatever, or just going and hanging out, sitting on the couch for a second, or just casual conversation. And it's a lot harder to make those connections and, over Zoom. And well, ultimately, both Kris and I are making films in that way now. It puts a lot more pressure on communication, and being very explicit with your communication, and being organized in that way. There's less of a sort of a shorthand that you can have when you're collaborating. But I do think that ultimately, hopefully what it's done is, it's sort of expanded the reach for studios to find artists and hire, and know that it is possible to make these things. It's trickier, but it's definitely possible to make these things. Stop motion being, I guess, an exception, but generally a CG film, it's possible to do that. Pulling in talent from worldwide and not necessarily having to have everybody in the same space. Although, for me personally, I enjoy that more. But we've always had freelance artists even when we are in studio. So it hasn't changed that much. But I think in terms of the film's release, it was a little anticlimactic. Often these things come with like a bigger celebration and stuff, and it was just sort of like a bit of a fizzled fart at the end of all of this 4 years of putting all this into it. And you kind of, the biggest thing for me that as I'm working on this, anticipating, I just want your head's down and you're so buried in it, and you want something to release to the audience to get a reaction, just to sort of tell you, yeah, keep going, you're on the right path, this is going to work. And so it was harder to, like Kris said, being in the theater with strangers, and
it's not the same as a Zoom wrap party with 300 people.
It's really not. It's really not.
The epitome of awkwardness, isn't it?
It amplifies it even more. It amplifies the awkward after party. But it was tricky, but ultimately I think it came, like Kris said, at the right time. I think we had it. It was still on the novel side of the virus, where we're definitely not in that anymore. So I think we got lucky.
Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned the voice casting. I really enjoyed the voice casting, and I just wanted to, can you just give us some insight on how that process works? Like, do you get to make suggestions? Is that sort of like, does Netflix have a role in that, or how does that process work?
For our film, I'm sure, like, if it was a different film, maybe a different experience, but we were cast by the time we made our relationship with Netflix. So ultimately that process was really a very pure approach of building an ensemble. So wearing my heart on my sleeve, I love comedy. So I've worked with Will on a number of films, and I always thought that Tim was really Will Forte, and in that way that you see Last Man on Earth, and he's sort of like doing kind of horrible things, but you're interested in like him, even though like he puts out nice guy persona, even though his characters don't always make nice guy choices, and that is a great kind of pearl of comedy. So like casting Will was pretty quick. Terry, again, I'd worked with him before. I think Jane Krakowski had worked with her before, and I knew that she was great with Martin because the 30 Rock or Kim Schmidt, like when comedians are like bounce well off of each other because of their history. And so I think like that process was very organic. I think the most interesting character was actually Alessia Cara, because we were looking for a voice that had the ability to kind of be musical, and at the time we wanted somebody who was Canadian for the sake of our production and what we were needing for in terms of the budget and what have you. And one of our editors was watching, was it Fallon? He was watching, and they were doing was it Fallon or Kimmel? Remember, Kyle? It was one of those late night shows. And
Jimmy Fallon, yeah.
Yeah, it was Jimmy Fallon. So, and they were doing a predict the future. What do you want to see happen in your life? And Alessia was like, I want to be a voice in an animated film. I think we called her like the next day because like she sounded so
perfect.
Yeah, so perfect. And I was nervous because she's not an actor, like but she was so natural, and I think the fact that she was very natural.
Yeah.
And like her against like her kind of lack of winking at the audience worked really well against what Forte does brilliantly, which is like Forte is very earnest in his characterization of what like Tim is, and he commits, and like she could just be very loose, and that kind of like tense, kind of repressed character against somebody who I always talked about, like Jane should feel like a chicken. If you ever held a chicken, like they're almost too light. Like I like that she had air in her bones, and we got that out of Alessia's performance. So yeah, it was. I think we were pretty lucky, but ultimately it is about casting your ensemble, and I think it's the same as what we were talking about with character design. It's not like, I don't really think of the poster. I mean, the poster is always important, but you're always trying to cast for that kind of whether it's you look at Kris Guest or SCTV, or like the way they build SNL cast, like you want energy from who is working off of whom. So that was key.
Nice. This one's from the audience. What makes a storyboard ideal or easy for people to work from? I know clarity is probably the obvious answer, but is there any other sort of tips you guys can give like potential storyboard artists?
Like I think medium matters. So if you're a storyboard artist and you're doing a preschool series show that's going overseas for production, clarity is key, because it becomes it's always the blueprint for an idea. Like that's the key thing. So what your blueprint needs to be is reflective on the product that you're making. And I think the biggest difference between feature storyboarding and series storyboarding is really auditioning of material. So like, and I've worked in a lot of TV and I've worked in a lot of feature. And I think, in terms of like the amount of, stuff we throw out in a feature process, it's an iterative process to get down to actually what feels like less time, because over the course of 56 episodes, you can really, you can play with a lot of different ideas and develop your characters in a series in a very different way. So for me, it's always like, I look for story artists that have the cinematic kind of filmmaking bones. So like to use like a very broad term, motivation is key. So motivation is to, what are your characters feeling? What's the subtext? What's the acting? It doesn't have to be clean drawings, you know what I mean? But like what are you giving me with as few efficient lines as possible to sort of say that there's a thinking person in this scene? And then that translates back to camera. like what are your camera choices? And because camera is a character, and so like when I'm working with artists, or like, I'm sitting in editorial, like often our decisions are coming from, what's the motivation for the characters on the scene, and then what's that relationship? Is the camera being honest while the characters are lying, or is the camera hiding something while the character is being honest, but we're using the camera to keep that truth away from the audience? All of these choices, and those are just two examples, but like to me, that's that kind of thinking is what I'm always looking for. So, I'll always tell young artists that it's sort of hard to get that into your portfolio, but like striving for that is I think valuable, and I think it's often what is where a career could begin, like that ability to sort of be a filmmaker. So once you get under the craft of the drawing, of perspective, of all of that kind of nuts and bolts stuff, it's about the filmmaking, and it's about the performance and how you capture it, if that makes any sense.
Oh, thank you.
And my experience working with Miller and Lord is anytime I worked too long on a drawing, or anytime I liked the drawing too much, they would kill it. So I got used to sort of like working rough, and sort of like the other thing is like looking at drawings as not drawings, but they're moments of time. And so that kind of like letting go of the ego is a real important part of sanity. Otherwise you'll go crazy as a story artist, because 90% of what you do is kind of sacrificial. So I think it's important to kind of think that way.
Yeah. Let's see. For you, were there any deleted scenes or parts of the story that you wish stayed in? And then for Kyle, any sort of visual development stuff that you wish that got cut that you wish made it in?
Kyle, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, there was a few character designs that I really liked. We had a character named Michelina. I'm not sure even where that name came from.
She worked the front desk, so our the person working the front desk at Braun was Mike.
Right.
So it was like a lady Mike, so Michelina. Huh?
That was a hard one to let go of. We were lucky on this film, but there's a lot of color choices for sequences that I was really happy with. Specifically, that clip that Kris showed of Tim in the battle, this imaginary war. I started to work the color script for that and got really excited about where that was going. And then, we made some choices about assigning colors to each of the characters of the kids. And the Barnabys were like this wild 80s, like sci-fi, lots of purple.
Cover of a Yes album, right?
Fuchsia and stuff. And that was really, really exciting. And there was some really cool stuff that came out of that, and that ultimately got scrapped. But it's part of the process, and like Kris said, you got to put the ego aside and know that it's always to make things better, and so you can get attached to stuff, but it can always live in your portfolio.
That Melanoff sequence that we stopped, like we worked with these four brothers called the Folter brothers, who were kind of famous in Vancouver for being kind of like self-made geniuses. They kind of came in and built this whole thing, and that was a hard one to cut, because I loved how kind of Rankin Bassett felt, and like we were really trying to make it feel like a like a low budget cartoon made in the 1970s. I wanted it to have and I also love the underbelly of like, who made this? Like, why did Commander Melanoff have this? Like I love the deconstruction of tragedy, So, but it was a very Citizen Kane sort of thing. It's like, why is this person depressed? Well, My Rosebud is a animated short that I had produced. So sit down and watch it. Yeah, it was just like, so that was a hard one to cut. But there's a lot of mom and dad dialogue that we had to cut. Some of the, their love story was really just hilarious to us. But I think, it was probably, weighted in the right way for the final product. But there's some really fun stuff there that we lost. What are you gonna do?
We have a question here that says, what advice do you have for design portfolios?
Kyle?
I think it's a tricky one. It's, everybody has their own opinion on this. And I think depending on the studio that you're going after, they're going to want certain things. And I think having as much of yourself in it as possible is really important. So just making sure that your personality and your point of view is coming through, as much as you may have to, you know, if you're trying to get hired at Pixar, you probably want to tailor your work to what they do. You know, you want to look at the kinds of films they do and the kinds of color they use and the kinds of designs and that kind of thing. But I would much rather, I always look for, I'll just step back. So when I start a film, we start with the visual guide, and I'm thinking about the look before we've even cast artists necessarily. Sometimes you might have a few come in early to help with the story process. So they'll do early character designs similar to the way we had, you know, Pete and Robin Joseph and some of those artists, just to help kind of lift things up and get things going. They're not necessarily what we've committed to yet, but it's helping us move the story forward. And then once I kind of have a visual idea, then I, just like Kris does with the, you know, the voice cast, I cast the art department. And so I look for portfolios that have a sensibility to what I'm after. So it's a bit of a reverse to what some of the studios do, but for me, that's where my best advice was, you know, be yourself, put that unique stuff, put the stuff that makes your art yours and your voice, make sure that that's in there and that comes through, because ultimately I will find a place for that if I see it and it works, you know. And I think that's more valuable than a portfolio where I feel is really specifically targeted towards one certain type of thing, which is completely fine if that's what you're after. If you want to work at Disney and that's been your lifelong goal, definitely that's what your portfolio should be driven towards. But I think there's a lot of value in having an eclectic range of influences, and I love to see that. Those are the portfolios I get excited about when I see something that's unique and new. And I'll always, you know, if I can get excited about that, I'll find a place for you. I'll just figure it out. You know, we'll make it work, because I just want that energy and those ideas, because it's not necessarily what I'm seeing in my mind. So I think that's going to be really beneficial to the process.
Thank you.
If that makes sense.
Oh, that's great. That's very thorough. All right, this is going to be the last question. So for both of you guys, what are some things you learned from working on the Willoughbys that you're going to carry on to your next project?
Kyle, do you want to start? Or should I start?
Do I want to start? Sure. I think the collaborative nature of it is something that I, you know, hadn't experienced in my previous jobs. And being, you know, it's not something you can always control. It's always up to the director, whether that's how they want to work or not. And I was really lucky. But for me as a production designer, I can at least take that and I can use that as a device to empower my team, you know, to get the best ideas and get a range of new ideas and push me to kind of think outside of my comfort zones and explore other avenues. So I think that, you know, writer's room collaborative process is something that I'll carry forever, because I loved it. I loved being involved. I think it was super beneficial to see what that side was, you know, what those discussions were, because they were really informative and helpful to what we were doing. And I think the more open you are as a filmmaker, I think the better and richer, the more trust you have in your team, the richer a film you're going to make.
I think you know, this was my first kind of, for lack of a better language, I guess, like an independent feature. So you know, in terms of like understanding the value of production, the value of like you know, how you build a team and how you build a pipe. You know, I've been lucky that I've had a lot of just amazing studios, like, you know, working at Sony, you're driving a jet, you know, it's like a Ferrari. And, you know, if you have a story problem and you need to sort of fix it with, you know, or a design that needs to change, you know, you've got like just all the tools sort of right there. And to some extent, we were kind of building the car as we were driving it. And I think, you know, my level of appreciation for production, for like, you know, those people that show up every day and sort of make sure that you're taken care of and that, you know, the planning makes sense and they're brave enough to say you're wrong, or like, you know, I mean, challenge the the process to protect what we're trying to do. Like, I guess I never really appreciated how valuable those individuals are, and that what that means to the sake of making a movie. So yeah, that was super eye-opening in this process. And I think yeah, I don't know, casting. Everything's about casting. 90% of the job.
Yep, for sure.